We're back talking about the squat this week. Last episode of this Describe series, we talked about the hinge. And the hinge is a pretty simple movement. However, clearly when you talk about the spine, the upper back, and all the other components that go into it, the hips, the knees, it gets a little complicated. The squat actually adds to that complexity. However, if we're really good at the stuff that we've been talking about for the past few episodes, we're going to find that transitioning all that information to the squat's going to be pretty simple. So what is the difference between a hinge and a squat? Well, a hinge is a hip-dominated movement. I'm just going to move from my hips while I'm still considering all of my spinal mechanics. When I squat, I'm actually going to be using my knees as well. So it's not just a hip-dominated movement, it's also a quad and a knee-dominated movement on top of that. Now, of course, there's different types of squats. You got your front squat, your back squat, and your single leg squat. And all of those have their different intricacies in how much hip and how much knee that they use. However, in comparison to the hip hinge, we are talking about some more knee movement as well. So why is the squat so important? Well, the squat's really important because just like I talked about with the hinge, where it's such an important and vital part of how we lift things, the squat is actually very much the same way. Especially when we talk about even just lifting furniture, squatting is going to be our dominant form of human movement that we're going to use in order to get that done. So when we squat, we need to make sure we're using all of the proper spinal mechanics, all the proper bracing and breathing procedures that we've been talking about, so that we can use these simple and basic human movements effectively, and so that we can also use them without injury, right? We want to be able to load up these patterns really heavy so we can get strong, and without the risk of putting ourselves in harm's way. So let's talk really quickly about what proper form looks like. So let's take a look at some of the considerations that we need to make when we do our squat and some of the common faults that seem to happen when people squat. To set up for a squat, what we're going to do is we're going to go feet shoulder width apart. And what we're going to do is we're going to have a little bit of toe out. Now, certain people, depending on the way that your hip is aligned, they're going to be able to have their toes a little bit straighter. But for most people, a little bit of toe out is the better option. And then what I want you to do too is I want you to put your arms out in front of you. So what this is going to do is it's going to help me get a little more balance. As I descend into my squat, from the front we're going to see a couple of things. I'm going to go down, and then as I go down, what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring my knees out, and then I'm going to keep an arch in my foot the entire time. And then I'm going to stand up. So what I didn't do there as I went down is I didn't allow my knees to come in and my arch to collapse. So from the front, those are the main things that I see people do as they squat. So with the squat, we want to have a really well-balanced movement. So from the side when we're squatting, as we go down, we want to push our butt back as well as allow our chest to fall forward so we can use our hips and our knees at the same time. So I'm going to go down here, keep the weight through the middle of my foot, stay nice and balanced, use my hip and my knee, and then stand up. Now the same rules apply as from that front view. I'm still bringing my knees out. I'm still keeping that arch in my foot. However, I'm just focusing on that hip and that knee being nice and balanced. So now the other things I want to think about from that side view as well is my spinal mechanics. So I don't want too much arch, and I don't want any sort of rounding in my lower back. Now we talked about this when we talked about the hip hinge in previous episodes. So as I go down, what I don't want to see is my lower back rounding here, and I also don't want to see too much arching. I want to find neutral, go down, and then go up. Now when we talk about the bilateral squat, the two-legged squat, there's really three main types. There's the front squat, the back squat, and then the overhead squat. Now the overhead squat is going to be a different conversation, but all those same mechanics apply, and usually the same mechanics that a front squat has typically apply more to the overhead squat, but again, that's going to be a conversation for a later episode. So let's just talk about the front squat and the back squat. Now, the front squat, which also includes our goblet squats, includes any sort of like dumbbell front rack squats, and then of course the barbell front squat, is going to be a more quad dominated movement because the weight's in front of us. Now, if we think about physics, this changes the way the moment arms work and the way our line of gravity works through our body, right? That's center of mass. So we've changed our center of mass. That means our torso has to be more upright, and then our knee has to travel more forward. So we have to use our quads to do the motion more. Our back squat is going to be more hip dominated movement for the opposite reasons. What I showed you guys over there was a more front squat looking motion where my torso is a little taller, hands are out in front of me, almost like as if I was holding some dumbbells out here, or goblet squat, or front rack squat. So we'll talk about the back squat here, and I also want to talk about breathing as well. So breathing is a very important part of all this, obviously, as we've talked about in previous episodes. So I'm going to grab my barbell here. And now hand positioning, I want your hands outside of shoulder width, but I'm going to get to that exact same shoulder width, toe out position that I was just in. And now, since the bar is on my back, I have to push my hips backwards more in order to keep the weight through the middle of my foot. So I'm going to go down, knees are coming out, chest is coming more forward than normal, hips are staying a little more back, weight still centered in my foot, thighs getting down to parallel towards that ground, and then I'm going to stand up. So, in comparison to the squat that I did over there, you'll see that it almost looked more like a hip hinge than the front squat would. The front squat I'm going to be a little taller. So with my front squat positioning, I'm going to have my hands on my barbell, right about shoulder width. Elbows are going to get nice and high. I'm going to find the exact same positioning, nothing changes. And then I'm going to go down, chest stays a little taller. I'm trying to keep my elbows up, getting to that full depth, and then I'm going to stand up. And what I'm going to do here too is I'm going to breathe in at the top, go down, hold that breath, and then as I start to push up, breathe out so I can further engage those abdominals to prepare for the load on the way up. So now our fourth type of squatting motion is our single leg squat. Our single leg squats, some of the mechanics change, but most of them actually stay pretty similar. The biggest thing that changes is instead of really trying to drive my knee out, right? So in that bilateral squat, I'm really trying to get those knees out as I go down. In my single leg squat, I'm actually trying to track my knee straight over my foot. I'm not trying to let it come in, not trying to let it go out, just straight down and then straight up. If I do this, I keep that weight balanced and keep that arch from collapsing. So that same rule applies. We don't want that arch to collapse. From that side view now, if I'm doing a single leg squat, and I'll show it in a staggered stance, I want to keep my weight centered over that foot, just like in the bilateral squat, by pushing my butt back, allowing my knee to travel forward, and also dropping my chest forward at the same time. Now, most of the single leg squatting you're going to be doing is not going to be with a leg actually in the air, right? Which is a totally valid drill. And it's a drill that we will do plenty. But a lot of it's going to be either in a staggered stance or a rear foot elevated position with a foot on the box or bench. So in this position, what people usually screw up is they actually get too much weight on their back foot, right? Their back leg, whichever leg's behind them. So if I'm in this staggered stance, what people tend to do is bring too much weight on this back leg and then come down here. What you want to be doing the whole time in a single leg squat, you want to focus on the leg that's supposed to be squatting. So in this case, it would be that front leg. You want almost all your weight on that front leg so you can do your squat. But the spinal mechanics stay the same, the breathing stays the same, and the hip and knee situation also stay the same. I want to be nice and balanced, I want to be nice and neutral, and going down and going up. Now, depth actually changes a little bit here in this single leg position. Big reason for that is because we're actually keeping that foot straight like we talked about. So our hip capsule has less room to play, right? When we get that knee out, we're actually moving some bony parts around that are allowing us to get to more depth. But in a single leg position, we're going to get to a little bit less depth. So good rule of thumb is 90-90, right? 90-degree motion with the hip, 90-degree motion with the knee. So that would be here. Let's pretend I have a dumbbell holding a goblet here, coming down, getting to 90 degrees at the knee, 90 degrees at the hip, and then standing up. That's usually going to be where most people's single leg squat depth is going to be limited to. What are some common limitations people have when they squat? So when we look at the front squat especially, there's some thoracic mobility at play. When we look at the back squat, having your shoulders back all the way there, some shoulder mobility can be a limitation as to how well you can squat. And then your hips are obviously going to be a big part. Now a big part is your adductors and your internal rotators, because we're trying so hard to externally rotate as we descend into that squat. The other thing that's a big limitation is the hamstrings, right? Specifically the short head of the biceps, which if you know your anatomy really well, you know what that is, but if not, it's totally okay. And then the biggest thing that people forget about is the ankles, which fortunately is getting a lot more talk now, but ankle mobility is a huge limitation for why people can't squat well. We're going to talk about a couple of drills today that are going to help those internal rotators get a little looser, right, those adductors, and then also the ankles. A really good drill is a toe elevated bent knee stretch. If we think about the main muscles in our calf, most of them don't cross the knee, right? The big calf muscle, that gastroc, that one crosses the knee, but all the other ones don't. So if we do a bent knee stretch, we're going to more target the things that are directly applied to our squat. So if I go into this bent knee position with my foot elevated, my toes elevated on this plate, what I can do is I can lean forward into this leg, drive my knee forward, and I'm getting a nice stretch right down low in my calf, in that same area that's going to be limited when I go to squat. What I'm going to do too is I'm going to try to drive this knee out so I get an even better stretch in the inside of that calf in the same area that's going to be limited when I squat, right? Because we like to do this. We like to internally rotate and collapse. We want to externally rotate. So I want to externally rotate and bend this knee as I do this stretch. Another really good mobility drill is going to target those adductors and those internal rotators to help us externally rotate is called the frog. So the way I'm going to set up for this is almost like a squat, except my chest is facing the ground and I'm in a quadruped position. So I'm going to be here with my hands and knees on the ground. And I'm still going to focus on good shoulder mechanics, good spinal mechanics, and good posture. So I'm going to drive my shoulders down, get good spinal mechanics, get my toes out, knees nice and wide, and I'm going to push my butt back into this stretch, rock forward, rock back, hold that for about like 10 seconds or so, come back forward, and just repeat this process. I like to always tell my clients, stretch for about 2 minutes. 2 minutes in everything to really start making some soft tissue changes. All right, team, I hope you're feeling a little more confident in your ability to do your squats now. Make sure to check out both my Instagrams, at John Williams Training and at Tiny Whiteboard Workouts. I post free workouts, 4-week programs on there every single month, so make sure to check that out. And also go to my website too, tinywhiteboardworkouts.com, to see the blog post on squatting, which should be up by the time this video is up. See you guys.